Emmanuel Macron's journey began in Amiens, a quiet provincial city in northern France, not typically known for producing national leaders. Born in 1977, he spent his early years amidst calm streets and traditional brick houses, a world away from the hustle and ambition of Paris. His parents, both physicians, were well-educated, secular, and comfortably middle class. From the beginning, Macron was immersed in an environment where books were treasured, intellectual debates were common at the dinner table, and curiosity was not just tolerated, but encouraged as a fundamental virtue. Asterisk before we delve into the main narrative, please consider subscribing to my channel, giving a like, leaving a comment, and sharing this video to support my work in bringing you more engaging content. Your support is greatly appreciated. As a child, Macron was somewhat enigmatic. Teachers recognized his brilliance, but also noted his restless energy and a theatrical flair that never quite crossed the line into recklessness. He was an avid reader, actively participated in school plays, and penned essays that displayed a maturity far beyond his years. While Amiens nurtured talent, it wasn't quite equipped to contain a young man who seemed to be attuned to a grander stage. A pivotal moment in his early life was not political, but deeply personal. As a teenager, he fell in love with Brigitte Auzier, his drama teacher, a woman over 20 years his senior. The relationship was considered scandalous in the small community, shocking to their families, and ultimately transformative for Macron. Despite his parents' attempt to separate them by sending him to Paris for his studies, their bond endured. It became a defining narrative of his life, a story of choice, unwavering determination, and a willingness to defy conventional boundaries. In Paris, Macron entered the highly competitive realm of France's elite education system. He pursued philosophy at Nanterre University, writing a thesis that explored the works of Machiavelli and Hegel, and briefly served as an assistant to the renowned philosopher Paul Ricoeur. Philosophy honed his analytical skills, teaching him to think in systems, to understand how power functions, how societies are influenced, and how history shifts when institutions either fail or adapt. However, Macron was not destined to remain solely a philosopher. He followed a path trodden by many leaders of the Fifth Republic. Sciences Po, followed by the École Nationale d'Administration, or ENA. More than just a school, ENA serves as a gateway into the heart of the French state. For Macron, it was also a crucible of ambition. He mastered the intricacies of budgets, laws, and negotiations, and understood the subtle mechanisms that keep a nation functioning. Upon graduating in 2004, he joined the Inspectorate of Finances, an influential body responsible for auditing and advising the government. At this point, Macron was not yet a public figure. He was a young technocrat, absorbing the workings of the state from the inside and connecting with influential mentors, including Jacques Attali, a celebrated economist and advisor. Attali recognized in Macron a rare combination of intellectual prowess and social grace, someone capable of discussing abstract concepts in the morning and captivating a room full of decision-makers in the afternoon. Yet, Macron felt constrained by the slow pace of bureaucracy. In 2008, he left the civil service to work in investment banking at Rothschild & C. This move surprised some of his left-leaning associates. However, Macron justified it as a pragmatic decision. To change France, he needed to first understand modern capitalism from within. As a banker, he worked on significant deals, most notably Nestlé's acquisition of Pfizer's baby food division. The job made him wealthy, but more importantly, it provided him with insights into the psychology of markets and global business, knowledge that would later inform his political instincts. The financial crisis of 2008-09 also had a profound impact on him. He witnessed how quickly systems could falter and how much governments depended on those who understood finance, often reluctantly. He emerged not as a radical anti-capitalist or a blind advocate for markets, but as a hybrid, pro-business in approach, socially liberal in values, and convinced that France needed both reform and protection for its vulnerable citizens. In 2012, Macron returned to government as Deputy Secretary General at the Élysée under President François Hollande. While Hollande's presidency was often perceived as cautious and lacking direction, Macron was among those advocating for bolder economic reforms. He argued that France's labor market was excessively rigid, that innovation was stifled by bureaucratic hurdles, and that Europe needed greater economic dynamism. He gained a reputation as someone who was quick, persuasive, and somewhat impatient. Someone who viewed hesitation as a sign of decline. In 2014, Hollande appointed him Minister of the Economy, Industry, and Digital Affairs. Macron was only 36 years old. The appointment was seen as a gamble on a new generation. As minister, he championed the Macron Law, a package of measures aimed at liberalizing sectors of the economy, allowing shops to open on Sundays, reforming transportation regulations, and easing certain professional restrictions. Supporters hailed it as essential modernization. Critics denounced it as neoliberalism in disguise. The law was passed using Article 49. 3. A constitutional provision that allows the government to pass a bill without a full vote, a fact that would later cast a shadow over Macron's career, as his reforms often relied on institutional power as much as on persuasion. However, something else was brewing beneath the surface. Macron was gradually distancing himself from Hollande's socialist camp. He was too centrist, too impatient with traditional party politics, and too convinced that French politics was trapped in a stagnant battle between a fading left and a defensive right. In 2016, he resigned from the government and launched his own movement, En Marche. This was neither a traditional party nor a conventional ideology. It presented itself as a force for progress, a departure from the old political landscape. Many underestimated him, as France has a history of charismatic challengers who quickly fade from view. But Macron's campaign generated a unique energy. He spoke of Europe as a destiny, of entrepreneurship as a means of civic renewal, and of France that should be open, confident, and modern without being heartless. He attracted votes from disillusioned socialists, moderate conservatives, and young urban professionals who desired a future not defined by anger. In 2017, with the far right on the rise and the traditional parties collapsing under the weight of scandal and exhaustion, Macron entered the presidential race like a political phenomenon. When he won, defeating Marine Le Pen, he became the youngest president in modern French history. The Fifth Republic had never seen a leader come to power without the support of either the traditional left or right. It was a break from the past, subtly elegant and inherently risky. At the close of Part 1, Macron stands in the courtyard of the Élysée Palace, newly elected, carrying the hopes of a France yearning for renewal and the anxieties of a France that has heard promises before. His presidency is about to begin, not as a continuation of the past, but as a test of whether a centrist revolution can withstand the realities of governing. When Emmanuel Macron began his presidency in 2017, he acted with a conviction that time was a precious commodity. France had entrusted him with breaking a political stalemate, and he was determined to demonstrate quickly that the change was genuine. During his initial months at the Élysée, he frequently spoke of transformation, not as a mere slogan but as a concrete plan. He believed that the country could not afford to remain stagnant. His primary focus was the economy. Macron contended that France's labor system, while deeply protective and symbolic, had become a barrier to hiring and innovation. In September 2017, he enacted sweeping labor reforms through executive orders, reshaping collective bargaining rules, capping compensation for unfair dismissals, and granting companies greater flexibility. Supporters lauded it as essential modernization to reduce unemployment, while unions and many left-wing voters viewed it as an assault on social protections that were integral to French identity. Strikes and demonstrations erupted in the streets. Macron listened politely, but did not relent. The speed was deliberate. Macron's worldview, shaped by his experiences in finance and state, held that the momentum for reform diminishes if not acted upon swiftly. However, French political culture operates on another premise. When leaders push too aggressively, society resists. This tension loomed over his first year like an impending storm. Then came the measures that solidified his image in the public consciousness. Macron eliminated the traditional wealth tax on financial assets, retaining it primarily on real estate, arguing that it would attract investment and retain capital within France. He reduced certain business taxes, tightened unemployment regulations, and spoke of rewarding hard work. In the boardrooms of Paris and at the European Commission, this made perfect sense. But in small towns and outer suburbs, the message was received differently. The label president of the rich began to stick, not because France resented wealth, but because people felt that the sacrifices were not being shared equitably. Macron's presidency was also defined by his style, not just what he did, but how he presented it. He spoke in lengthy, meticulously structured sentences, often philosophical and frequently technocratic. He favored televised addresses and grand settings. His supporters saw this as upholding the tradition of a Fifth Republic Jupiterian president, leading with clarity from above. Critics, however, found it to be aloof, even condescending, particularly in a country where leaders are expected to demonstrate an understanding of everyday struggles at the grassroots level. In 2018, Macron launched a second wave of reforms, targeting the state itself. He pushed for changes to the railway system, seeking to eliminate certain special employment protections for new SNCF hires and prepare the system for increased competition. This move was a political minefield. Rail strikes in France are as predictable and powerful as the tides, imbued with a strong sense of collective memory. The strikes occurred precisely as expected. France witnessed transport disruptions, and Macron's government once again refused to back down. In his view, this was another test. Could France embrace modernization without becoming paralyzed by its past? For a time, it seemed possible. Growth was showing modest improvement, job creation was on the rise, and Macron's international standing was soaring. Abroad, he was seen as the most dynamic pro-European leader in the West at a time when populism was gaining ground. He advocated for a stronger Eurozone, a common European defense, and a moral imperative of integration. He fostered a close working relationship with Angela Merkel, hoping to revitalize the Franco-German partnership at the heart of Europe. This international success was important to him. However, the more he became Europe's champion, the more some French citizens suspected that he was listening to Brussels and corporate boardrooms more than to them. The turning point came not from a major ideological clash, but from something painfully ordinary: fuel prices. In late 2018, the government planned to increase fuel taxes, particularly on diesel, as part of climate and carbon reduction strategy. In Paris, this policy seemed like a sensible step towards environmental sustainability. In rural France, where people commute long distances and public transport is limited, it felt like a punishment for lacking alternatives. A movement formed online and then manifested in roundabouts. People wearing the yellow safety vests that every driver is required to keep in their car. The yellow vests, gilets jaunes, were not a union, a party, or a single ideology. They were a cry from the margins of the country, from people who felt invisible to the Parisian elite. The first nationwide protests on November 17, 2018 were massive. Roadblocks sprang up, highways were gridlocked, and anger filled the air with raw, spontaneous energy. Soon, Saturdays belonged to movement. In Paris, demonstrations occasionally turned violent, with clashes around the Champs-Élysées and symbolism striking at the core of the Republic. Macron's approval ratings plummeted. Initially, Macron reacted like a reformer facing resistance. He held firm. He argued that the fuel tax was essential for the planet. But the movement was not solely about fuel. It was about purchasing power, dignity, and the feeling that sacrifices were being demanded from the bottom while benefits flowed upwards. The protests forced Macron to acknowledge a reality he had underestimated. France's social contract was not merely an economic issue. It was an emotional one. In December 2018, after weeks of unrest, Macron abandoned a planned fuel tax hike. He announced wage increases and tax concessions designed to calm the country, including measures to increase take-home pay for low-income workers. It was a retreat, but also an acknowledgement that the reform project could not succeed if society felt humiliated along the way. He then tried a different approach: the great national debate. Macron toured the country, holding marathon town hall sessions with mayors and citizens, listening to complaints about taxes, services, democracy, and the cost of living. 4 hours at a time, he absorbed anger, debated, and explained policy. These meetings revealed another side of him, not cold, but intensely engaged, even stubbornly determined to persuade. Supporters said that he was finally connecting with France on a personal level. Critics argued that the debate was a theatrical performance that changed little. But politically it mattered. It stabilized the situation enough for the government to continue moving forward. By 2019, Macron's presidency had shifted in tone. The reform drive did not cease, but became more conscious of the need for social cushioning. He spoke more frequently about inequality and regional neglect. He promised improved public services outside of major cities. Yet the Yellow Vest period had left deep scars, a profound distrust of elites, a heightened protest culture, and a president now associated with both modernization and disruption. Part 2 concludes here, with Macron standing in the aftermath of France's first major social upheaval of his presidency, still committed to reform, but acutely aware that change in France is never solely about policy. It is about recognition, respect, and the fragile dignity that people feel in their everyday lives. Part 3 will follow the next phase, Macron's attempt to regain control through pension reform, the arrival of COVID-19, and the way crisis pushed him to reinvent his presidency a second time. After the Yellow Vest upheaval, Emmanuel Macron entered 2019 like a man who had survived a fire and could still smell the smoke on his clothes. He had not abandoned his belief in reform, but he had learned something colder and more difficult. In France, a president can win elections and still lose the feeling of legitimacy if people believe the nation is being changed without them. The great national debate gave him breathing space, but also left him with a wound that never fully closed, an awareness that the country's anger was not a passing storm, but a deep weather system. Macron's response was to attempt a reform that every French president approaches like a cliff: pensions. In late 2019, his government unveiled plans to replace France's complex patchwork of pension regimes with a single points-based system. The objective sounded technical: simplify, make it fairer, keep the system solvent as the population aged. But pensions in France are never merely technical. They touch identity, the dignity of work, the memory of social struggle, the promise that a lifetime of labor ends with security. Macron's team framed the reform as modernization. Unions framed it as a quiet theft of rights. On December 5, 2019, a massive strike wave began. Transport froze in Paris. Schools staggered. Public services slowed. For weeks the country moved in a half-paralyzed rhythm. It became the longest transport strike in modern French history and one of the largest social conflicts since 1968. Macron held his line. He argued that if France did not reform pensions, it would be forced into harsher cuts later. Protesters answered with a kind of stubborn endurance equal to his own. It was a classic French standoff. A president who believed he was saving the future, and a society that believed the future was being taken from them. Then history interrupted the argument. In early 2020, COVID-19 arrived, and suddenly pensions seemed almost quaint compared to the scale of the new threat. France entered lockdown after Macron's televised address on March 16, 2020. The country that had been fighting about retirement ages overnight began fighting for oxygen, hospital beds, and the ability to keep daily life going. Macron's presidency pivoted again, away from reformers' battle and toward crisis command. Those first pandemic months forced Macron into a leadership posture that was more paternal than Jupiterian. He spoke to France repeatedly in wartime metaphors, declaring we are at war with a virus. Borders closed, streets emptied. The French state expanded into households through permits, curfews, and emergency rules. Like most leaders, Macron was learning in real time. Some measures were praised as decisive. Others were criticized as late or confusing. But the emotional register of his presidency changed. The image of a young technocrat pushing reforms gave way to a president trying to protect the country from an invisible flood. Economically, the government overturned its earlier fiscal caution and poured money into saving jobs and businesses. The whatever it costs approach became the new orthodoxy. Macron, the former banker who once spoke of competitiveness and flexibility, now had to speak the language of social shelter. In that period, his critics could no longer accuse him of ignoring the social state. Instead, they argued about whether his government was handling the health and logistics well enough. As waves of infection rose and fell through 2020 and 2021, France moved in cycles of restrictions. Macron announced repeated curfews and lockdowns, including a third national lockdown in spring 2021. Vaccination campaigns accelerated, and the government introduced a health pass system for public venues, later tightened into the vaccine pass. For supporters, it was a necessary tool to protect hospitals and keep society open. For opponents, It felt like coercion by administrative decree. France debated freedom and responsibility again, this time with masks and QR codes replacing fuel taxes. Politically, the pandemic did something paradoxical. It softened some social conflicts while sharpening the country's deeper mistrust. People wanted protection, but they also distrusted elites who explained protection from above. Macron tried to manage this contradiction by emphasizing science, expertise, and European cooperation. France partnered closely with the EU on vaccine procurement and recovery funding, and Macron doubled down on his long-standing claim that French power in the 21st century depended on a stronger Europe. By the time France emerged from the worst pandemic phase, Macron faced the next decision that defines modern French presidents: whether to seek a second term. In early 2022, he formally entered the race again. His campaign style reflected the era he had just lived through. There was less of the 2017 meteor energy, more of a president asking the country to trust his experience. He ran on 3 pillars: recovery after COVID, strengthening French industry and energy sovereignty, and defending Europe in a world turning rougher. He also returned carefully to the pension theme, promising to raise the effective retirement age as part of keeping the welfare state sustainable. The election atmosphere was heavy. Traditional parties remained weakened. The far right and far left were strong. Many voters did not love Macron, but they feared alternatives. In the first round on April 10th, 2022, Macron came first, Marine Le Pen second, repeating the duel of 2017. The second round became a referendum not only on Macron, but on what kind of France people feared most: a technocratic center that reforms without warmth, or a nationalist right that promised protection through exclusion. On April 24th, 2022, Macron won re-election with about 58.5% of the vote. It was a clear victory, but not a triumphant one. Turnout and enthusiasm were weaker than in 2017, and Macron understood the message. France had given him another mandate, yet the country's patience was thinner and its fractures deeper. Even supportive newspapers described the victory as tepid, shadowed by a far-right vote at historic highs. That night, Macron walked onto the Champ de Mars with a different kind of confidence. Not the bright certainty of a newcomer, but the worn composure of someone who knows his second term will be harder than his first. The yellow vest had taught him about social dignity. COVID had taught him about vulnerability and state power. Re-election had taught him that legitimacy is not a trophy you win once. It's a relationship you must rebuild every day. Part 3 ends here, with Macron re-elected, but carry a nation that is more anxious, more polarized, and more demanding than the France he first met in 2017. Part 4 will follow the opening years of his second term: the loss of a parliamentary majority, the return of pension reform with Article 49. 3. The shock waves of the Ukraine war on Europe and energy, and how Macron tried to govern France that no longer automatically follows presidents, even when it elects them. Macron's second term opened without the victory music he might have imagined. He had won re-election in April 2022, yes, but the country that re-elected him did so with a tired gaze. Weeks later, that fatigue showed up in the most concrete place French presidents fear: the National Assembly. In the legislative elections of June 2022, Macron's centrist alliance lost its absolute majority, turning his government into a minority that had to negotiate every law or force it through. The Fifth Republic is designed for strong presidents, but only if Parliament cooperates. Macron started his new term already leaning on a wobbling table. Elizabeth Borne, his prime minister, became the daily face of his precariousness. She was competent, loyal, and often caught in a political crosswind. To pass budgets and big reforms, the government repeatedly used Article 49. 3. France's constitutional shortcut that allows a bill to be adopted unless a no-confidence motion succeeds. By late 2023, Borne had used it dozens of times. Each use kept the state moving. Each use also deepened the feeling, especially among opponents, that Macron governed over society more than with it. The big test returned, exactly where Part 3 left it: pensions. Macron believed the pension system was an unfinished reform that France could no longer postpone. It wasn't ideology for him. It was arithmetic. People lived longer, Fewer workers supported more retirees, and the budget strain would grow. His government proposed raising the legal retirement age from 62 to 64 and tightening contribution rules. To Macron's allies, it was responsible stewardship. To millions of French citizens, it felt like the same bargain again. Elites telling ordinary lives to stretch further. Early 2023 became a season of marches. Unions united in rare solidarity. Streets filled from Paris to provincial cities, not only with anger, but with a kind of wounded pride. It wasn't just about 2 years. It was about dignity, about who gets to define fairness in a country that treats social rights like part of its soul. Macron's instinct was firm. He feared that retreat would make France ungovernable and his presidency irrelevant. When negotiations stalled, the government used Article 49(3) to pass the reform in March 2023. The law went through, but legitimacy did not. Nights of protest flared, sometimes violent. Approval ratings sank. Yet Macron stayed with his old belief. A president is elected to decide, and sometimes decision means enduring unpopularity. The pension reform became a scar that his second term would carry forward. Proof to some of courage, to others of arrogance. While France fought on its sidewalks, Europe fought an old war in a new century. Russia's invasion of Ukraine had already reshaped Europe in Macron's first term. In the second, it became a constant background drumbeat. Macron positioned France as both a supporter of Ukraine and a voice for European strategic autonomy. He supplied military aid, joined sanctions, and pushed for EU unity, while also trying, especially early on, to keep a channel open for eventual negotiation. His style annoyed some Eastern European leaders who heard his softness, but it fit a lifelong Macron theme. France is a balancing power that wants Europe strong enough to speak for itself. The war also hit France through energy prices and industrial anxiety. Unlike Germany, France had a big nuclear fleet, and Macron seized a moment to declare a nuclear renaissance. He backed new reactor construction, accelerated permitting, and framed nuclear as both climate tool and sovereignty shield. In the same breath, he promised a faster rollout of renewables. It was Macron trying to redraw France's energy identity, less dependent, more electrified, and more competitive in a world where energy had become geopolitics. Domestically, he pushed what he called reindustrialization. He aimed to repatriate production, prioritizing sectors like batteries, semiconductors, green technology, and defense. France, under his leadership, actively hosted investment summits, courting global firms in an effort to transform a nation into a Central European hub for the burgeoning new energy economy. Critics argued that the benefits of these initiatives seemed overwhelmingly concentrated in Paris. Supporters, however, contended that France was finally acting with the assertiveness of a major global power once again. Either way, Macron was staking his legacy on the promise that modernization could still generate employment opportunities, but only if France acted swiftly enough. However, the political landscape beneath him continued to shift. Throughout 2023 and early 2024, Macron's minority government struggled to forge stable coalitions. Navigating immigration policy required painful compromises, and the far right steadily gained traction in opinion polls. Social discontent, far from disappearing after the pension reforms, simply manifested in new forms. Farmers protested rising costs and stringent regulations. Suburban communities expressed concerns about security. Rural areas questioned the continued erosion of public services. Each grievance coalesced into a broader sentiment. People were uncertain whether Macron's vision of France still included them. Then came June 2024, when Macron made the most audacious move of his presidency. In the European Parliament elections, his centrist list suffered a devastating defeat at the hands of Marine Le Pen's national rally. That very night, Macron addressed the nation on television, announcing the dissolution of the National Assembly and calling for snap legislative elections to be held on June 30th and July 7th, 2024. It was the first dissolution since 1997, a high-stakes gamble intended to jolt France out of its state adrift, force a moment of clarity, and potentially restore its legitimacy through a renewed parliamentary mandate. But France did not respond with clarity. It responded with fragmentation. The snap election resulted in a hung parliament. The left-wing New Popular Front emerged with the most seats, followed by Macron's Ensemble Bloc, and the far right achieved a historic level of representation. No single party came close to securing an absolute majority. While the country avoided an outright far-right government, it entered a deeper, more insidious form of instability, one that transformed every future law into a negotiation fraught with the looming threat of no-confidence votes. Macron initially retained Gabriel Attal, his young prime minister, as a caretaker for several weeks, before finally accepting his resignation in mid-July. From that point onward, France stumbled through a seemingly endless rotation of prime ministers and fragile coalitions, a period of political paralysis that extended well into 2025. The dissolution, intended to restore authority, had instead exposed just how precarious that authority had become. Even Macron later admitted that the decision had created more division than solutions. And yet, this was quintessential Macron. When confronted with an obstacle, he would attempt to break through it rather than circumvent it. Sometimes the obstacle yielded, sometimes it didn't, but he refused to govern passively. Part 4 concludes here, at the precipice of that gamble. France finds itself politically divided, socially weary, and strategically aware. Macron remains president, but the foundation of his Jupiterian model has fractured into a multipolar parliament and a public mood that no longer affords automatic deference. Part 5 will delve into the final phase of his presidency. The era of instability following the dissolution, the struggle to keep reforms alive within a fragmented assembly, and the ultimate verdict of history on a leader who sought to modernize France against the current of its own discontent. The summer of 2024 was envisioned as a reset. Emmanuel Macron had dissolved the National Assembly after the shock of the European elections, betting that a snap vote would either renew his mandate or force a clear alternative to emerge. Instead, France delivered a parliament with no center of gravity. The left-wing New Popular Front emerged as the largest bloc. Macron's Ensemble Bloc came in second, and the National Rally secured a historically strong third-place finish. No one held majority. Everyone possessed a veto. The Fifth Republic, designed for presidential dominance, suddenly resembled a house with too many exits and no master key. Macron remained president, but his accustomed Jupiterian style, ruling from above, no longer resonated as it once had. Following Gabriel Attal's resignation as prime minister in mid-July 2024, France drifted into a prolonged period of interim governments and delicate negotiations. The nation settled into a new, daily rhythm. Politics as endless negotiation, each budget and law teetering on the brink of a no-confidence vote. In this environment, Macron's second term entered its most paradoxical chapter. He had always believed that decisive action created legitimacy. Now legitimacy depended on patience, coalition building, and, at times, accepting that action might be more modest than ambition. The president who once outpaced the system was now compelled to walk alongside it, or risk being publicly tripped up by it. The first major battleground of this late period was the state's finances. France's deficit and debt were already substantial, and the hung parliament transformed every attempt at fiscal tightening or investment into a political minefield. Macron attempted to maintain a bipartisan approach, calling on both the left and right to learn to govern without a majority, and signaling that he did not intend to dissolve Parliament again as soon as the Constitution permitted. It was less a grand vision than a plea for functionality, the voice of a president who understood that the country could not afford institutional paralysis amidst war and economic strain. But functionality required a government that could withstand votes. In December 2024, Macron appointed François Bayrou, a centrist veteran and longtime ally, as prime minister, hoping that Bayrou's reputation for dialogue might soothe the Assembly's frayed nerves. It was a quintessential Macron move, when politics shatters into fragments, bring in a mediator and attempt to piece the fragments back together. For a few weeks, it seemed promising. Bayrou spoke softly, pledged respect to all factions, and prepared a deficit reduction budget designed to reassure markets. Then the budget landed like a stone in a shallow pond. Bayrou's plan included deep spending cuts, tax adjustments, and symbolic gestures like eliminating public holidays. The left perceived austerity aimed at workers. The far right saw a political trap. Even element of the center feared a backlash. In September 2025, Bayrou called for a confidence vote to force unity, and lost decisively. His government collapsed after just 9 months, the second such collapse in less than a year. France watched yet another prime minister exit the stage while Macron remained in the background, attempting to keep the lights on. The fall of Beirut revealed a crucial aspect of the late Macron era. The president still possessed constitutional power, but far less political capital. Every successive prime minister faced the same constraints within a hung assembly. Governing had become a form of survival. The carousel continued. In October 2025, Sébastien Lecornu was appointed and resigned within hours of naming a cabinet after conservatives withdrew their support, making him the shortest-serving prime minister of the Fifth Republic. Markets reacted negatively. Opposition parties called for Macron to resign or dissolve parliament again, and the phrase political crisis ceased to sound like a headline and began to feel like the prevailing climate. Throughout all of this, Macron attempted to maintain a broader strategic focus. He kept France firmly committed to supporting Ukraine, militarily, industrially, and diplomatically, arguing that Europe must not become timid. At the same time, he championed his vision of French and European sovereignty, defense cooperation, supply chain reindustrialization, and an energy policy centered on a nuclear renaissance coupled with renewables. Even amidst domestic gridlock, he leveraged the presidency's international standing to keep France looking outward, to prevent Europe's engine from stalling completely. Yet the late presidency was haunted by a more subtle question. What happens when a country elects a leader but no longer trusts him to execute his vision? Macron's critics had long argued that his reforms were imposed from the top down. The dissolution gamble, intended to renew legitimacy, instead highlighted the exhaustion of the political center. The national rally and the far left gained strength not only due to their own narratives, but also because a significant portion of France no longer believed that mainstream elites could protect their purchasing power, identity, or security. Macron, who once symbolized renewal, now symbolized a system that seemed unable to make decisions. And yet, there was another truth underlying frustration. Even Macron's opponents often conceded that France had not retreated into isolation under his leadership. The country remained a prominent voice in Europe, a driving force behind EU industrial and defense initiatives, and one of the few Western nations attempting to address long-term sovereignty rather than short-term anxieties. His insistence on nuclear power, for instance, refocused a debate that had been largely dormant for years. His industrial policy attracted investments in batteries, semiconductors, and green technology that might otherwise have gone elsewhere. These achievements were less visible than street protests, but they were nonetheless real threads in the tapestry of his decade in power. So by late 2025, Macron's presidency felt like two stories layered on top of each other. One story was domestic, a president trapped in a fractured parliament, witnessing prime ministers come and go, struggling to pass budgets in a country where every faction can say no, but none can sustain a yes for long. The other story was strategic, a president determined to keep France influential in a dangerous world, advocating for European strength, energy independence, and a modern state that still believes in itself. Their collision defines the emotional tone of Macron's final stretch. He is not a president who yields easily. When pushed, he tends to push back. When the system slows down, he attempts to jolt awake. That impulse made him the youngest president in modern French history. It also created the defining risk of his second term. That speed without consent can generate the very paralysis it seeks to overcome. Part 5 concludes in a France that is still living within the experiment Macron initiated in 2017. The institutions remain the same, but the mood has shifted, more pluralistic, more distrustful, more resistant to top-down authority. Macron remains at the helm until 2027, but the ship now sails with a crew that does not automatically obey its captain. Whether history will regard him as a modernizer who prepared France for a more challenging world, or as a reformist who underestimated the country's need for social sensitivity, will depend on how France emerges from this era of fragmentation. For now, the story leaves him where he has often stood, at the center of a restless nation, insisting that progress is still possible, even when every road seems to argue otherwise.